Hey guys, for this Halloween, I made a few new decorations from a miniature door. I made a doormat, light up eyes and candles, a light up cauldron, thing, books, a broom, wrap crystals, and wall decor. For my doormat, I drew a spiderweb template, then cut the shape out of a piece of black foam board. I used a pencil to mark my spiderweb sections. Then went over it with white paint. I made a bunch of curves and added another layer of paint. For the light up eyes, I cut a cereal box to fit the doorway and added tape to make tabs to easily remove the board. Then added lights and held them in place with washi tape. I covered the board with paper and left openings for the tabs. Then drew an eye template and added eyes where the lights were. I outlined them with pen and painted the background black. Then taped the paper to the board. To make candles, I used a tube from a soap bottle dispenser. I cut it, then taped the end to a paintbrush so that it would be easier to add drips of hot glue around it. I tested the lights to make sure everything lined up. For the light up cauldron, I used foil to make a cauldron shape and added a hole. Then mixed glue with a bit of water, dip pieces of paper in it, and covered the foil. I used a paintbrush to press the paper down. Then I traced the rim on parchment paper, added a circle of hot glue, and placed a cylinder from a tape dispenser roll in the center. I hot glued a mini ball ornament to make a dome, then peeled it off and added it to the circle of glue. I added more glue. Next, I cut a hole in the parchment paper, placed it on the cauldron, and added drips around the edge. I mixed black acrylic paint with sculpting medium and painted the cauldron. Then I added the light from this ornament to the hole. I covered the glue with acrylic ink. Then assembled the pieces. To make thing, I rolled and wrapped foil into the shape of a hand. Then covered the whole thing with layers of washi tape. Using washi tape seemed like it would be easier than trying to cover the entire hand with glue and tiny pieces of paper. Although it probably would have been easier to make the hand out of clay. I mixed acrylic paint and sculpting medium, then painted the hand. I used color pencils to draw the stitches and nails. then went over it with a thin pen and blended it with color pencils. For the books, I cut rectangles from a piece of board to use as my pages, then glued 3 layers and clamped them together. I cut a cereal box to make the book cover. Then sanded the pages and painted the covers black. I changed a couple to brown and painted the pages golden brown. Then glued the pages inside the cover and clamped it. For one of the books, I looked up the book used in Buffy, shrunk the image, made a back and spine, and printed it out. I covered it with a layer of Mod Podge to laminate it. Then cut it out and glued it to the book. For the broom, I cut a wooden skewer and used acrylic ink to stain it. To make the bristles, I used the fibers from burlap. In pairs, I added them onto a strand using a lark's head knot. I sprayed water to straighten them and trimmed the flyaways. Then made a knot near the end of the stick and glued it. I wrapped it around the stick, going upward, and glued the end under a few bristles. Then I made a gathering knot. To do this, form a U shape with cord and wrap around all the bristles a few times going down. Place the end through the loop created. Pull the top end so that the loop gets tucked under the wrap part. I added glue before pulling the cord fully under. Then cut both ends. I trimmed the ends. I also wrapped a couple pieces of selenite using a gathering knot. For my wall decor, I looked up monarch butterfly online, resized the image, and printed a bunch out. I also typed and printed out a small sign. Then taped the front and back to laminate it. I cut them out and folded the center of the butterflies. And here's how they turned out.